The storm had passed, leaving the earth drenched and the air heavy with the smell of wet grass and clay. The hills of northern Arizona glistened under the muted light of the setting sun. David Reynolds, 58, stood near the broken gate at the edge of his property, muttering under his breath. The flood from the night before had damaged much of his fencing, and he'd been patching it up since morning. His dog, Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, had disappeared hours ago, something that rarely happened. "Where'd you run off to, old boy?" David muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Just then, the sound of paws crunching through the wet soil made him turn. Relief swept through him, but his relief quickly turned into disbelief. Ranger wasn't alone. Trailing behind the muddy, exhausted dog were 2 tiny, trembling figures, golden brown with faint spots still visible on their fur. Lion cubs. David's hammer slipped from his hand. Oh my lord! The cubs looked barely 6 to 8 weeks old, their fur plastered to their fragile bodies, eyes wide with exhaustion. They stumbled after Ranger, who stopped just a few steps from David and stared up at him with a strange mixture of pride and defiance. The cubs collapsed into the mud beside Ranger, panting heavily. David froze. He had spent 3 decades as a wildlife biologist before retiring, and he knew instantly what he was looking at. African lions. In Arizona? Impossible unless... Before he could step closer, Ranger let out a low growl, placing himself between David and the cubs. "Easy, boy," David whispered, raising his hands, but the message was clear. Ranger was protecting them. David's gaze shifted to the hills. No lioness in sight, no roars, just the wind through the mesquite trees and the rushing water from the swollen creek. Kneeling, David studied the ground, paw prints, drag marks, signs of chaos. A memory sparked. 2 nights ago, on the radio, he'd heard a report of an overturned truck on a remote dirt road near the creek. Authorities suspected wildlife trafficking. Some animals had been recovered, but others were still missing. And now 2 lion cubs were on his land. David's heart pounded. If traffickers were involved, the cub's mother was either dead, captured, or far away. These 2 had no one except Ranger. "All right," David murmured. "Let's get them safe." He opened the door to his barn workshop and stepped back. To his surprise, the cubs, still wobbling on unsteady legs, followed Ranger inside without hesitation. He shut the door and pulled out his phone. He called Dr. Emily Carter, an old colleague who now worked at the Wildlife Protection Agency. "David, you're not going to believe this," Emily gasped after hearing his story. "The accident near you? We've been searching for missing animals. 2 lion cubs were unaccounted for. You found them." David glanced at Ranger, who was licking mud off the cub's fur with slow, careful strokes. "Found them? Emily, I think Ranger's adopted them." Emily hesitated. "They need to be in our care immediately." "I know, but look at this." David sent a quick photo. Ranger curled protectively around the cubs, who nestled against him as if he were their mother. A long silence. "3 days, David," Emily finally said. "Keep them safe, send me daily updates, and then we'll collect them. But this is temporary." David hung up and exhaled. Temporary or not, he owed it to Ranger and to the cubs to make those days count. That night, David dug through old storage boxes, formula bottles from his rescue days, blankets, medical kits. He prepared a corner of the barn into a warm den. When he returned, he found Ranger had already arranged the cubs on a blanket, their tiny bodies curled into his thick fur. David knelt and studied them. The larger cub had a serious expression, his eyes sharp even in exhaustion. The smaller one was restless, batting playfully at Ranger's tail as even sleep tugged at him. "Leo and Theo," David whispered. "That's what I'll call you." The first night passed in anxious vigilance. David dozed in an armchair, waking up whenever the cubs whimpered, but Ranger never faltered. When Theo cried for hunger, Ranger nudged David awake, guiding him to the bottles. When Leo tried to wander, Ranger gently herded him back. At dawn, David found Ranger outside with the cubs. To his amazement, the dog was showing them how to relieve themselves away from their sleeping space, instincts crossing species lines. David chuckled. "Well, Ranger, looks like you're a better parent than most humans."
Over the next 3 days, the transformation was stunning. With Ranger's care, Leo and Theo grew stronger. They followed him everywhere, mimicking his posture, his way of sniffing the ground, even the way he sat. David, fascinated, began taking notes like the scientist he once was. On the second morning, he caught Ranger teaching Leo how to stalk. Ranger crouched behind a bush, eyes locked on an old pillow in the yard. Leo clumsily copied him, belly pressed low to the dirt. Theo, impatient, bounded forward, ruining the ambush. Ranger merely sighed, picked him up gently by the scruff like a lioness would, and set him back at the start, again and again, until Theo learned patience. David scribbled in his notebook, "Interspecies parenting behavior, unprecedented." By the third day, the cubs were playful, healthy, and attached. Too attached. Ranger never left their side, even skipping meals to guard them. When Emily arrived that afternoon, her jaw dropped. "These cubs were near death 3 days ago," she whispered, watching Theo chase Ranger's tail, while Leo crouched in the grass, eyes locked on a beetle. "They're thriving. Because of him." David nodded. "So, you'll take them now?" Emily hesitated. Ranger lay in the sun, patiently letting Theo climb over his back while keeping an eye on Leo. It was not mere protection, it was teaching. "I'll extend it, 1 more week. But David, you know this can't last forever." David's smile faded. He knew. Lions weren't pets. Weeks passed. 1 week turned to 2, 2 to 3. Leo and Theo grew fast, their bodies filling out, paws heavy with the promise of the predators they would become. David expanded the barn into a play yard, with logs for climbing and a shallow pool for swimming. Ranger taught them everything: how to move silently, how to wait before pouncing, even how to play without hurting each other. David watched in awe. "He knows they're lions, Emily. He adjusts his lessons. He doesn't try to make them dogs." Emily, documenting each visit, shook her head. "This is rewriting what we know about animal behavior." Even Dr. Martin, an experienced veterinarian, was stunned. He said, "They're healthier than any cubs I've seen raised in captivity, and they've learned discipline from a dog." By the time the cubs were 3 months old, the bond had deepened beyond explanation. Ranger wasn't just a guardian, he was part of their pride. And strangely, Leo and Theo began teaching back. Leo, the focus one, led Ranger in mock hunts, showing instincts that even Rangers seemed to admire. Theo, ever playful, invented games of chase that Ranger joined with surprising patience. It wasn't just parenting anymore, it was family. But family, David knew, couldn't last. One evening, Emily called. "The reserve is ready. They've prepared a special habitat for the cubs. It's time." David looked outside. Ranger was showing Leo and Theo how to stalk through the tall grass. The cubs, no longer helpless, moved with confidence. They were lions now. David's throat tightened. When? Tomorrow morning. That night, David barely slept. He heard the cubs tumbling in the barn, Ranger's soft growls keeping them in line. He wondered if Ranger knew this was their last night together. At dawn, David watched Ranger licking Theo's ear, while Leo resting against his side. A perfect picture of family, and one about to be torn apart. When Emily arrived with the transport team, Ranger refused to move. He blocked the cubs, his body rigid. "Ranger?" David whispered, kneeling. It's time. The cubs, sensing something, pressed against Ranger, whining softly. David's chest ached. He placed a hand on Ranger's back. You saved them. You gave them life, but now you've got to let them go. For a long moment, Ranger's eyes locked with David's. Then, slowly, painfully, the dog stepped aside. Leo and Theo were loaded into secure crates, crying out as Ranger barked, pacing beside them until the truck pulled away. David felt his heart break. Ranger sat in the dust, staring after the truck long after it disappeared. For the first time in years, David saw tears in his old dog's eyes. Months later, David and Ranger visited the reserve. Leo and Theo, now powerful juveniles, prowled the grasslands of their enclosure. They had grown into strong, confident lions. When Ranger barked, the two young lions froze. Recognition flashed. They bounded toward the fence, not with aggression, but with pure joy. David's vision blurred. Ranger stood tall, tail wagging slowly. But after a while, he turned away. His job was done. As they drove home under the golden Arizona sky, David placed a hand on Ranger's head. You did good, old boy. Ranger leaned into his touch, eyes fixed on the horizon. Some way behind them, two lions lived because of him. And somewhere ahead, life went on. Sometimes, David thought, love wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go, so those you love can become what they were always meant to be.